There are homes where silence is peaceful, where the hush between rooms means rest or reverence. But Sycamore Hill was not that kind of home. The silence there felt held in, like something had been swallowed whole, but never digested. The long hallways echoed with the ghost of a woman who had once filled them with light. And ever since she passed without warning, without explanation, her 10-year-old son Emmett hadn't spoken a full sentence. Not to his father, not to the staff, not even to the stars he used to whisper to at night from the balcony outside his room. The help came and went. Some couldn't stand the unease. Some said they heard footsteps upstairs when no one was there. Some just couldn't bear the weight of a house stuck somewhere between mourning and denial. But then one Tuesday morning, a woman arrived. She didn't wear perfume or pearls. Just a blue coat buttoned up high, a soft gray scarf around her neck, and a small leather Bible tucked beneath her arm. Her name was Miss Thelma Grace, and she said very little when she was introduced to the staff. She simply looked up at the house, at its cracked shutters and overgrown roses, and whispered, "This place is holding its breath." No one paid her much attention at first. After all, she was just the new help. But that night, for the first time in 8 months, young Emmett slept the whole way through. And in the weeks that followed, the winds changed around Sycamore Hill. Small things happened, quiet things that no one could quite explain. The boy started humming again. The dog stopped barking at shadows. And the piano, the one in the parlor that hadn't been touched since the funeral, played a single broken chord at midnight. Something was waking up, and it had everything to do with the woman in the blue coat. At first, they said nothing. The cook nodded politely. The gardener tipped his cap. Even Clara, the long-serving housekeeper, forced a thin-lipped smile when Thelma Grace unpacked her things in the small room beneath the stairs. But underneath that silence was a current. Not cold exactly, but not warm either. A kind of wary restraint, like the whole house was watching her from behind lace curtains. Thelma didn't mind. She'd known that kind of silence all her life. She kept her hands busy laundry in the morning's floors in the afternoons and supper prep in the quiet hours between. She moved with deliberate grace, like every motion was measured not by time, but by intention. In her room, she placed only 2 items on the narrow windowsill: a photo of a man in uniform faded by sun, and a mason jar filled with dry sweetgrass. A soft smell of the south coast lingered in her wake, earthy with a hint of something floral and far away. By the 3rd night, young Emmett began sleeping through until morning. By the 5th, he greeted her with a nod at breakfast. And by the end of the 1st week, he whispered thank you when she handed him warm milk before bed. That's when Clara started whispering. It began behind pantry doors, and in the linen closets, hushed comments to the cook, little jabs delivered with a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. "She's got the boy too quiet, don't you think? Always making her own teas. You ever seen what she puts in them? I'm just saying it's unnatural. The child's been mute for months, and now he's singing lullabies." The cook didn't say much, but word travels fast in a house like Sycamore Hill. One afternoon, Clara approached Thelma directly in the hallway outside the nursery. "Miss Grace," she said, tightening the lace collar on her blouse, "I'd like to review your references again. The lady from the church never sent over anything formal." Thelma looked up from the mop bucket, calm as still water. "I believe I gave what was needed, Miss Clara." Clara's nostrils flared. "It's not personal. The boy is delicate, that's all. We can't just let anyone get too close." Thelma said nothing, just returned to wringing out the mop. Her silence said more than a paragraph might have. It was not defiance. It was restraint. But that night, Thelma placed her worn Bible not beneath the boy's bed as usual, but on the windowsill where moonlight could touch its spine. Something had shifted. A few days later, Clara pressed harder. She pulled the cook aside, voice low and urgent. She said, "She's from Georgia, right? Then why does she speak like a school teacher? And those words she uses? Sometimes I think she's mocking us." The cook shrugged. "Boy's sleeping, ain't he?" Clara scowled. "It's not just about sleep. It's about control. And I've seen this before, believe me. They come in soft and quiet, and before you know it, they're pulling the strings." She paused, lowered her voice even more. "Next, she'll be asking for things. More pay, her own room upstairs, access to the study, you'll see. The cook didn't answer. But something about Clara's tone left a bitter taste in the air. Meanwhile, Thelma continued as always. She never raised her voice, never pushed. But there was a strength in her calm, a quiet command that even the dog seemed to recognize. When she passed, it stopped barking and sat straight. One evening, just after supper, Clara followed Thelma out to the garden where the boy had taken to reading in the sun. Miss Grace, Clara said, arms folded tight. "I'll be straight with you. I don't trust sudden miracles. I don't trust women who keep things to themselves, and I especially don't trust folks who walk into a home like this and act like they already know its secrets." Thelma turned slowly, sunlight catching the rim of her glasses. "It's not your trust I came here for," she said softly. "It's the boy's healing. One has happened, the other hasn't." Then she turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Clara in the garden, fists clenched and chest tight. That night, the boy whispered another phrase through his cracked bedroom door. "Miss Thelma sings like Mama." And somewhere in the parlor, the old piano shifted. No one touched it. But one of the ivory keys, just one, sounded low and hollow like a distant memory returning home. And from that moment on, the house began to change, not with thunder but with stillness, not by force but by presence, and not because Thelma demanded power, but because truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It was the kind of evening when the wind forgets which direction to blow. The shutters along Sycamore Hill clicked and rattled like old bones. The clouds, swollen and purple with stormlight, hung low above the live oaks. It had been a day of tension, the kind that simmers quietly, never boiling, but turning every look a little longer, every silence a little heavier. That afternoon, Clara had stood at the far end of the drawing room staring at the grand piano. It hadn't been played since the funeral, not since Emmett's mother, Marian Lancaster, had passed so suddenly and so privately. No sheet music had rested on its stand. No fingers had touched its keys. Even dust, it seemed, was too afraid to gather on it. Until tonight. The first sound came around midnight. Low, just one note. A broken F struck with the hesitation of memory. Miss Thelma Grace was the only one awake. She sat in the hallway outside Emmett's room, knitting by lantern light. She didn't flinch when the sound came. Her hands kept moving quiet as breath. And when the second note followed soft and hesitant, she closed her eyes for just a moment like she was listening to something older than the house itself. Emmett stirred behind the door, then rose. He opened it slowly, finding Thelma sitting cross-legged, that same gentle rhythm in her hands. "Did you hear it?" he whispered. Thelma nodded once. "Some things remember even when we forget." He stepped closer, resting his head against her shoulder. She didn't move, just kept knitting. The lantern light flickered on the brass doorknob beside them, casting long, low shadows like stretched-out secrets along the wall. Downstairs, Clara awoke with a start. She'd heard it too, the sound, that key. She sat up in bed unsure whether it had been real or just the remnants of a bitter dream. But then came another note, and another, hesitant. Not a melody, just touches, as though someone were feeling their way back to something once familiar. Pulling on her robe, she made her way toward the parlor. Each step down the stairs felt louder than it should have. Her slipper brushed the edge of the hallway rug. Her hand gripped the banister like it might bite. And there it was, the piano, closed, silent. But something had changed. A fresh print, small, dusty on the stool's velvet cushion, and just one key, slightly depressed as if only a moment ago it had been struck with the lightest finger. Clara stood there frozen. She couldn't explain it, couldn't disprove it, and that terrified her more than anything else. In the morning, no one spoke of the music. The breakfast table was filled with the quiet clink of silverware and the rustle of folded napkins. Mr. Gerald Lancaster read his paper. Emmett stirred honey into his oats. But there was something in the air now. Not tension, not quite, but anticipation, like the house itself was waiting. The cook leaned toward Thelma that afternoon while washing dishes. "Heard what sounded like singing last night," she said, voice just above a whisper. "Only, It wasn't no voice I recognized. Thelma didn't look up from drying the plates. Some songs belong to memory, not mouths. The cook nodded slowly. She wouldn't press. But Clara couldn't leave it alone. Later that day, she marched into the garden where Thelma was trimming rosemary by the walkway. "I know what you're doing," she hissed. "All this quiet charm and spooky nonsense. You're turning this house upside down. That child, he's too soft to question you." Thelma didn't turn around. "The boy isn't soft, he's healing." Clara took a step closer. "I've seen women like you, polite on the surface, manipulative underneath. You come in with your potions, your calm voice, your little symbols." She motioned toward the sweetgrass bundle hanging discreetly by the kitchen doorway. "Don't think I haven't noticed. You're filling his head with ghosts and lullabies. It's dangerous." Thelma turned then, slowly, calmly, and for the first time her voice carried just a trace of steel. "No, Miss Clara. What's dangerous is telling a child that silence is the only safe place to live." Then she brushed the rosemary sprigs into her apron and walked back toward the house, leaving Clara to fume beneath the cypress trees, the shadows of late afternoon stretching long behind her. That evening, Emmett asked Thelma for a story. Not just any story, one about stars. He said his mother used to tell him they were the ceiling of heaven. Thelma nodded, taking his hand. "She wasn't wrong," she said gently. "But heaven's not so far up we can't hear it when it sings." Then she pulled out a folded piece of cloth and embroidered handkerchief and began to tell him about the constellations. Not from a book, but from memory. From long nights spent under Georgia skies where stars whispered to the restless and the broken. Emmett listened, eyes wide, as the room filled not with ghosts, but with wonder. And somewhere far down the hall, a piano key shivered again in the dark. The sugar tin was tucked behind the flour sack, far back in the cupboard, too far to be accidental. It was Clara who found it. She hadn't gone looking for secrets. At least that's what she told herself. She was simply straightening shelves in the kitchen pantry when her hand knocked the tin loose. It hit the floor with a muted clang, the lid popping free like it had been holding its breath. Inside, no sugar, just a folded letter, yellowed edges, ink that had bled slightly from age. Clara hesitated, then unfolded it with the same care one might use disarming a trap. It was addressed to Dr. Harold Jackson, Department of Colored Psychology, Howard University. Her heart thudded. She read the first few lines, then again. She didn't understand all the words' terms like developmental trauma, nonverbal grief response, symbolic transference, but she understood enough. Thelma Grace wasn't a maid, or at least not only. She was educated, sharp, connected, and if Clara had to name the feeling creeping into her spine, it would not be fear. It would be something colder, displacement. That night, Clara sat in the staff quarters, eyes red-rimmed and jaw tight. "She's not who she says she is," she muttered to the cook. "She's playing a part. And we've let her in, we've let her close." The cook didn't reply, but her hand stilled over the dough. "You read what she wrote," Clara pressed. "This wasn't no reference letter. It was a plan. A psychological observation of the boy. Like he's some project." She spat the last word like it tasted of vinegar. Meanwhile, upstairs, Thelma was brushing Emmett's hair with a soft boar bristle brush. He was half asleep, already curled up with a drawing in his lapstick figures beneath a bright yellow star. He'd drawn Thelma taller than the others, with a blue dress and a halo made of loops. "Mama used to say you could read a person by their silence," he mumbled. Thelma smiled faintly. "Then I reckon you've read me just fine." He nodded, eyes fluttering closed. Later that evening, Gerald Lancaster summoned Thelma to the study. It had been weeks since they'd spoken more than a polite nod in passing. He was a man of routine, of ledgers and cigar smoke that clung to his coats like old pride. She stepped into the room, standing quietly before the hearth. The flames cast light across her face, soft and flickering. "Miss Grace?" he said, his voice low and tight. "Is there anything you'd like to share with me?" She said nothing. He reached into the drawer and pulled out the letter, placed it on the table between them like a drawn weapon. "This was found in your belongings." Thelma's eyes didn't waver. "And what did it say to you, sir?" He blinked. "It said you're a psychologist, or at least trained like one, that you've studied my son, That you came here with an agenda. She nodded once. Yes, I came here because someone needed to. Gerald's hands tightened around the edge of the desk. You should have disclosed that. Would it have changed your answer if I had? A long silence. Outside, the storm shutters groaned. Somewhere down the hall, the grandfather clock began to chime the quarter hour. Why, my son, he asked at last, voice quieter. Thelma's gaze softened. Because trauma leaves fingerprints, Mr. Lancaster, and his were all over that house before I stepped foot on the porch. She took a breath. Your wife died alone. The staff say she was unwell, but Emmett carries more than grief. He carries guilt and confusion, and he's been left to make sense of it all in silence. Gerald closed his eyes. His hands trembled slightly. I didn't know how to help him, he admitted. No. But you knew how to protect yourself from the parts of his pain that reminded you of your own. She stepped forward, slowly placing a small folded paper on the desk. This is my professional reference, my credentials, and a copy of the consent form I carry in every domestic placement explaining that I document trauma cases where appropriate. He stared at it, then at her. This house wasn't built for truths like yours. Then it's time it learned to stand on different ground. Later, Thelma stood alone in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The letter had been returned to her, creased now, but still intact. She tucked it back into the sugar tin, and this time placed it on the top shelf, plainly visible. No more hiding, not for her, not for the boy, not for the house still learning how to grieve out loud. And from that moment on, every drawer and door in Sycamore Hill seemed just a little easier to open, as if the truth had started unlocking things far beyond just the heart of a child. The air that night tasted like copper and pine. Sycamore Hill lay hushed beneath a low sky heavy with heat. The rain hadn't come, but the humidity hung thick between the trees like breath caught in a throat. Lanterns flickered under porch eaves. Even the cicadas held back their song as if sensing something waiting to ignite. Inside the house exhaled sleep. Gerald Lancaster retired early. Clara had taken her ledger upstairs, still brooding over the way Thelma Grace had stood her ground in the study that morning. And Emmett, after weeks of silence turned into steady whispers, had left a drawing by Thelma's door, a charcoal sketch of a woman holding a light. But somewhere, perhaps in the attic, perhaps in the walls, something sparked. No one knew what caused it. Faulty wiring, they'd say later. An old fuse. A mouse chewing too close to the wrong filament. But whatever it was, it found breath. Flames bloomed behind the attic vent like angry blossoms. Then they lunged across the rafters, swallowing air with a roar. By the time the smell reached the hallway, it was already too late to stop it. Thelma woke first. She didn't run. She moved fast, yes, but with purpose. Her feet found the floor before her mind caught up. Smoke curled under her door like fingers. She grabbed the small satchel from her chair, already packed, always ready, and pushed into the hallway. Clara was shouting. The cook was opening windows. Mr. Lancaster stumbled out in shirt sleeves, coughing. "Where's the boy?" Thelma didn't wait for an answer. She already knew. Emmett had gone back. When the fire alarms shrieked, he'd woken confused, then remembered something. His mother's portrait. The last one taken of her hung in a brass frame on the third-floor landing outside the attic. He'd drawn her so many times now it felt wrong to leave the real one behind. By the time Thelma found him, the smoke had turned the stairwell into a tunnel of ghosts. He stood at the landing, eyes wide and wet arms around the portrait, coughing. "I couldn't let her burn," he rasped. Thelma didn't speak. She simply wrapped one arm around the boy, pulled the frame to her chest, and turned into the smoke. Her other hand reached for the banister, then found only heat. But still, she moved, step by step, breath by breath, until the hallway opened back into night air and voices gasped and water from a garden hose hissed uselessly at the flame-stained sky. They sat together on the lawn, the boy and the woman. Ash clung to their hair. The portrait, charred at the edge, rested between them like a fragile truth rescued from oblivion. Mr. Lancaster knelt beside them, but it was Thelma's hand that soothed the boy's shaking back. It was her voice he answered when the ambulance arrived, and it was her name he said clearly this time as the medic checked his lungs. "Miss Thelma saved Mama's picture. The fire burned through the night. The attic collapsed. Half the roof gave way. The nursery and Thelma's quarters were lost, but the lower floors held. By dawn, the fire was out, but the smoke lingered like an accusation. Gerald watched the sun rise from the porch swing, his hands black with soot. He hadn't spoken since the rescue, just watched. Watched as the staff tended to burns, moved valuables, swept ashes, and watched Thelma, who never once sat down. She didn't ask for praise, didn't cry. She just worked silently, steadily, until Emmett finally slept in the guest room downstairs. It wasn't until late morning that Gerald approached her. She was in the kitchen peeling oranges for the boy. He stood in the doorway, hat in his hands. "I don't know how to thank you," he said softly. She didn't turn. "You don't have to. Just don't forget." "Forget what?" Now she turned, eyes steady. "That healing isn't quiet. It screams, it kicks, it runs into fire for what it loves." She handed him a small wrapped cloth. He opened it slowly, revealing the scorched corner of the portrait Emmett had saved. "This is all he had left of her," she whispered, "and even that he almost died for." "Then why did you go after him?" Gerald asked. "Why risk your life for a picture?" Thelma tilted her head. It wasn't the picture. It was the part of him that still believed something was worth saving. Later that evening, Clara stood on the back steps, arms crossed. She had watched it all unfold, the fire, the rescue, the boy clinging to the woman she had tried to push out. She had heard him cry for Thelma, not her, had seen Gerald look at the maid with something close to reverence. And in her silence, something inside her cracked, not from grief, but from knowing the ground beneath her had shifted. And it wasn't hers anymore. That night, with smoke still clinging to the curtains and embers glowing faint beneath broken beams, the boy finally slept with the window open. And Sycamore Hill, though burned, no longer felt haunted. It had survived something, and someone had stood in the flames for it. The dining room smelled like lemon oil and ash. The windows were thrown open, trying to rid the air of what had happened. But no breeze could chase out the weight that sat thick in the walls. Sunlight spilled across the breakfast table, highlighting the contrast: fresh eggs and scorched wallpaper, silver utensils beside smoke-stained curtains. At the head of the table, Gerald Lancaster sat in silence. Emmett, bandaged at the wrist, picked at his toast. The cook had made extra preserves, and Clara had laid out fresh linen as if to will things back to normal. But normal had been set ablaze, and Thelma Grace sat across from them, her hands folded, eyes clear. No one spoke until Gerald cleared his throat, the sound brittle. "There's something I need to say." Clara froze. Her knife hovered mid-spread. "I've made mistakes," Gerald continued. "Ones I didn't know I was making. Because I thought silence was safer than truth." He looked at Thelma. "You didn't just come here to care for my son. You came here to confront something. Maybe not just in this house, but in me." Thelma didn't blink. "I came here because silence left long enough becomes rot. It eats at the walls. And eventually someone has to name what stinks." Gerald gave a rueful nod. "Clara found your letter. She gave it to me." Clara flinched. Thelma didn't move. And I read it. All of it. You've been documenting what you've seen here, not just in Emmett, in all of us." He placed the folded paper on the table between them. "At first I was angry. I thought it was a betrayal." He paused, then said more softly, "But now I think it's the first honest thing this house has seen in years." Clara finally found her voice. "She came in under false pretenses. That's deception." Thelma turned to her, voice even. "No, that's strategy. Women like me have learned how to move through spaces where truth gets you turned away at the door. You manipulated us. I revealed you." The words dropped like stones into water, sending ripples far and wide. Gerald leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Tell me, Miss Grace, why this house? Why us?" Thelma looked at the boy. Because Emmett's silence wasn't his alone. It belonged to this house. To you. To the people who walked past pain and pretended not to see it. I couldn't save his mother, but I could make sure her son didn't carry the same burden unspoken. Then she reached into her satchel and placed another item on the table, a small photograph. It showed a younger Thelma standing beside a man in military uniform and a woman in nurse whites. All three black, all three unsmiling, yet strong. On the back, a handwritten note, 1948, Sycamore Hill, staff dismissed without cause. Gerald stared at it. My grandfather ran the house then, and fired mine, after they asked for equal wages. The silence returned, but it was different now. Not cold, just honest. Later that day, Emmett approached his father in the study. Dad. Gerald looked up startled. The boy rarely called him that. Can we keep her? Who? Miss Thelma. Gerald smiled faintly. I don't think she came here to be kept, son. Then ask her to stay anyway. That evening, the household gathered on the back porch. Gerald stood with a clipboard, papers in hand. He cleared his throat. Effective immediately, he announced, Miss Thelma Grace is no longer listed as domestic staff. She will serve as this family's wellness consultant, educational, psychological, and otherwise. Clara opened her mouth, closed it again. Also, Gerald continued, we'll be launching a review of our family's hiring practices. Across the estate and the business, Miss Grace will oversee the recommendations. The cook grinned. Emmett clapped softly. Thelma said nothing, but in her stillness there was something like triumph, not pride exactly. Just relief, long delayed. Later that night, Thelma stood alone in the garden. The smoke had cleared. The stars were visible, bright and insistent. From behind her, Gerald stepped quietly. My wife. She always said the house felt heavier in some places. I thought she meant ghosts. She wasn't wrong, Thelma said. But some ghosts just want to be acknowledged. Thank you, he said, for not walking away. She nodded. Some houses are worth saving. Not for their walls, but for the children who still believe in them. And that night, for the first time in years, Sycamore Hill slept without whispers behind its doors. Because the truth had finally pulled up a chair at the breakfast table. And it had been heard. 6 weeks later, the porch swing creaked beneath the weight of something new. Not grief, not guilt, something lighter. Emmett sat beside Thelma's feet, not quite touching the ground notebook in his lap. He'd taken to writing stories lately, short ones about trees that whispered, and houses that remembered, and women who saved things without anyone asking them to. The repairs to Sycamore Hill were nearly done. But the real work, the quiet kind, had already been happening long before the walls were patched. It was happening every morning when the boy woke without nightmares. Every evening he asked for a story instead of silence. Every time he said please or thank you without being told. Inside, Gerald Lancaster was reviewing new policies, blind hiring, equal wages, educational grants for the children of staff. He was moving slower now, but forward nonetheless. As for Clara, she had stepped back, not fired, not exiled, just finally quiet. Whether shame or reflection softened her, no one could say. But when she passed Thelma in the hall now, she nodded, not out of habit, but acknowledgement. Thelma never claimed a bedroom upstairs. She preferred her small room by the kitchen, where morning light hit the window just so, and the wind smelled of rosemary and sweetgrass. One evening Emmett asked, "Do you think Mama would have liked you?" Thelma didn't answer right away. She just looked up at the sky, at the stars beginning to pierce the velvet dusk. I think she said softly she would have been glad someone stayed long enough to hear you. The boy nodded content with that. And in the hush that followed, the house around them breathed easy. A quiet lesson from Sycamore Hill. Not all heroes wear uniforms. Some arrive with quiet hands, patient hearts, and a truth they carry like a lantern in the dark. Miss Thelma Grace didn't need recognition. She only needed a child to sleep without fear, and a house to stop mistaking silence for peace. In a world still struggling to name its ghosts, her story reminds us that healing isn't always loud. It's steady, consistent, and rooted in love. If this story reached a quiet place in you, let us know in the comments. What did it awaken? Who in your life was a Miss Thelma when you needed them most? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, not just remembered, please subscribe to Hidden Black Voices, because sometimes the loudest truths are whispered.